Okay, I want to preface this that I am recording this on May 3rd. So the Leafs just, scored the tying game, putting the series to three apiece. So this Saturday, I might be eating my jersey because Boston might have won. But if not, then that means that the Leafs are going to the second round. So I am bleeding blue right now. I'm wearing my Leafs jersey in hopes of manifesting that second round. Or I might just be watching this, in a couple of days and just cringing beyond belief. But here we are. Let's dive in. This is going to be a little bit of a different one. This one I think is going to be a little bit of a fun one. So please join me as we talk about the solo careers of the Genesis band members. I saw on Twitter a couple days ago somebody asking who had the best solo career of all the Genesis members. Was it Phil Collins? Was it Peter Gabriel? Was it Mike Rutherford? Was it Steve Hackett? And because it was a Twitter poll, they could only allow 4. And I'm like, well, where's my boy Tony? Where's Tony and all of his orchestral stuff? So I wanted to kind of dive a little bit deeper into that question and what it means for the best, right? Are we talking about the most commercially successful one? In that case, it would probably be Phil Collins. Are we talking about the one that was the most impactful in the music community and the one that really played around within the art form of music? That one is probably Peter Gabriel. Are we talking about the most prolific and the one that was going out on tours the most and, really celebrating the music and continuing to play all that much? And that would obviously be going to Steve Hackett. But I wanted to kind of take a quick glance at all of the different musicianships and all the different solo careers that these boys have had. And to kind of start us all off, I wanted to do a little bit of a side sweep. Let's talk about the members of Genesis that I feel don't get talked about really at all. And I want to talk about the original 3 drummers from Genesis, starting with Chris Stewart, who was with the group when they were still calling themselves Garden Wall, while they were still kind of coming out with some songs. They did their first recording of The Silent Sun way back in the time, way back in the day, same, I believe, with The Winter's Tale. But then he was replaced by John Silver. And John Silver is the individual that was actually recorded on their first release, which was From Genesis to Revelation. Now, both of these guys didn't really have too much of a music career after that. Chris Stewart basically just became a farmer, which I think is just really, really interesting. And John Silver, I believe he was more of a teacher. I think he just kind of continued to teach. And John Mayhew, which was the individual that Silver's replaced once they went into Trespass, he really didn't have too much afterwards in terms of a music career, at least what I could find. Once he kind of, left Genesis, he was just kind of okay, bye. I think all that we know is that he moved to Australia and he works as a carpenter. So I like the idea that 2 of Genesis's founding drummers, one became a farmer and one became a carpenter. And that's all that we kind of know. That was when eventually with Nursery Crimes, that's where Phil Collins comes in. Now, during this time, this is also where Anthony Phillips comes in. And I do want to talk about Anthony Phillips because I feel as if Anthony Phillips is kind of the unsung hero. And luckily, he does get quite a little bit, he gets quite a bit more of the notoriety than John Mayhew and the other founding drummers, only because he was with them a little bit more because each one was on an album, and in the case of the first one, wasn't even on an album. But he at least had a continuing musical career in terms of putting out albums under his own name. And I think one of the main reasons why he left the band was more to do with his anxiety attacks of performing live music. He didn't want to be on the big touring circuit. He didn't want to be on stage. And some of the albums that he put out, I think, are some of the best. He was extremely, and I guess he still is, extremely, extremely prolific, and not only just putting out whatever it is that comes in his mind with these kind of private pieces or private parts and pieces, which I think we're up to 12 now. but also like these straight up full on studio recordings. I think the most notable one that a lot of us know is his first one of The Geese and the Ghost, which is still my favorite of his. And it really showcases his presence. You know, it's very Britannian in his playing styles. You know, it's very luscious green countrysides and fields and whatnot. Same with Wise After the Event and Sides and 1984. Like, those are I think the 4 big albums that I own from him, as well as I think I have his first Private Parts and Pieces, if not his second one after that. Now, unfortunately, that is where I fall off the bandwagon from Anthony's work. I know that every couple of years he puts out another Private Parts and Pieces, which are kind of somewhere between like a demo and like a full-fleshed studio recording. You know, it's just kind of like what's milling in his mind at that point. And I know that he also spent a number of time helping out his bandmates. You know, like I know that he was on Mike Rutherford's Small Creepers Day, which we'll get to in a bit. But I know that he was also on Steve Hackett's Out of the Tunnel's Mouth back in 2009. So like these guys are still working, you know, these guys are still working together, which I absolutely love. I think that's so great that these guys are still able to play extremely well within, you know, each other's kind of side projects. You know, I don't think he really had the best in any of the categories, you know, outside of just kind of doing what he wants. And I think that's so cool. You know, he's just this musician, this minstrel that's just able to do what he wants. And I think that's really, really cool. And that's really, really like he's found his lane and he stuck to it, you know, and I really have to applaud him for that. Okay, but let's talk about some of the other artists that we've had on here. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about Tony Banks because unfortunately, I always feel like out of the big careers, you know, Tony Banks has kind of had that unsung hero within the Genesis catalog. Like at least Anthony Phillips has The Lovers of the Geese and the Goose. The Goose and the Ghost, The Ghost and the Geese, whatever that first one was. But I just feel like his solo stuff never really caught on. Which is a little bit of a shame because I thoroughly enjoy his work and he has some of the best orchestration of sounds. And that comes right from his first solo album, which was A Curious Feeling. And yeah, you can see like this is a man that was trying to have his cake and eat it too with these experimental, very progressive, very atmospheric and moody tracks blended with radio pop hits. And he didn't quite know which way to go. Very similar to how, you know, Genesis was doing at the same time of like the late 70s and early 80s. Unfortunately, A Curious Feeling is kind of like that. It's a little disjointed, and maybe one day I'll do a full-length album review for it. But like in terms of the soundscapes, in terms of the actual atmosphere that's found on it, it's one of his strongest works, and I absolutely adore some of the deeper cuts on this. It's just a shame that it's also plagued with all of these radio-friendly, very run-of-the-mill, middle-of-the-road pop hits that don't really make any kind of a splash that his contemporaries and his other bandmates had. You know, like at this point, like Peter Gabriel had already put out Salisbury Hill. I think Phil Collins at this point was just about to release In the Air Tonight. And even Mike Rutherford was having some success with some of his like Slow Creepers Day. So it just kind of felt like, hey guys, I can participate too. And it just, I don't know, it didn't quite land. Bank Statement, I was never all that excited for as well. And Strictly Inc. was just, it wasn't until he put out his more orchestral classical stuff that I started to get really excited for, and I really fell in love with his music. 7, 6, and 5 released in 2004, 2012, and 2018 respectively. I mean, 5 pieces for orchestra, was my favorite record of 2018. And it still remains my favorite piece that he's ever done. It's some of the best music that any member of Genesis has ever written. And that is where I feel as if it's a little bit of a shame that these works aren't really getting the notoriety that they are, because really hasn't found the audience, you know, like the proggers of the 70s. I feel they could get a little bit bored with orchestral sounding music, and the general pop loving fan base that they accumulated in the 80s and 90s would find this as a dirge. And like, why are we listening to classical music? I mean, he did 2 soundtracks of The Wicked Lady and soundtracks, but I don't know, they just didn't quite hit. So unfortunately, like, Tony Banks is kind of the unsung individual within all this. And even Mike Rutherford had a little bit more of a long lasting and, his own solo stuff, like Small Creepers Day, which was released back in 1980. I thoroughly love. Like, there's the full 1-piece track on the one side and some really interesting, shorter pieces on the other side. And then Acting Very Strange in 82 was really, really interesting. But then he also had his Mike and the Mechanics discography, where he found quite a bit of success. Like, I remember talking with my stepmom about Genesis and talking about Mike Rutherford. And she's like, Mike Rutherford? You mean the guy from Mike and the Mechanics? And like, she had known Genesis, but didn't realize that that's where he was from. And so you have, they were quite prolific within their studio outpour, starting in 1985 and going right until like 2019. Like, he's still putting them out. Now, I will admit, I haven't actually dived into Mike and the Mechanics, so I can't really talk about what those sound like. But in terms of like having this prolific life outside of Genesis and his own solo career, like, he put out 9 records under the Mike and the Mechanics discography. And that's on top of his 2 that he put out with just his own solo work. So yeah. Now, I don't think that it kind of got that same notoriety that, say, Phil Collins or Peter Gabriel did. But it definitely was prolific enough and favorable enough to have some kind of a following. I still don't know if it quite landed with audiences as well as the ones that we're going to be talking about next. So let's move on to Steve Hackett. And Steve Hackett, I think, out of all of our boys that we've talked about so far, is the one that like really kind of captured the like progressive rock statements. He's the one that's still out there playing progressive rock music. And I mean, he released an album this year that is a full concept progressive rock album. This first album of Voyage of the Acolyte, which is all about like the tarot decks. He always really balanced his solo guitar music with this kind of progressive rock and progressive music, So if he wasn't making this big magnum opus of progressive rock like he did with Voyage of the Acolyte, Please Don't Touch, and Spectral Mornings, he was at least trying something different within his virtuosity as a guitarist on tracks like Defector, Guitar Noir from the 90s, Bay of Kings from the 80s. I think where we really found this rejuvenization of his work was after he put out the Genesis Revisited stuff. And he started getting into like the To Watch the Storms and Wild Orchids. That is where, in the early 2000s, where he started to shift and really play within, what does progressive rock guitar music sound like? And it was where we got Wolflight in 2015 that we really captured on this. And I think this is where Steve Hackett has, I think, the more hardcore dedicated niche fan base than all of these. Like, Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins definitely have a bigger fan base for sure. But like, these are the guys that are following Steve Hackett on Cruise to the Edge. These are the guys that are still following Steve Hackett as he's playing these classical Genesis pieces even to this day. Like, we will watch him play all of Foxtrot or Selling England by the Pound, or heck, if he decided to do all of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Now, I know on his current tour he's only doing highlights, but if he just came out and said, hey, I'm going to play the whole Lamb, I think all of us would lose our minds. So in terms of like dedicated fan base, I think Steve Hackett kind of takes it with that, just with how dedicated he's been to the classic progressive rock landscape. So That leaves Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins. Let's talk about Peter Gabriel first, because Peter Gabriel, there since the beginning, kind of poster child for the longest time. When he left After the Lamb, he really went into the his solo career. Now, obviously, a lot of this was, he left Genesis to spend more time with his family, but I think a lot of it was also just to create the music that he wanted to create without having to worry about either letting his own bandmates down or being constrained by whatever they like playing it within their sandbox. He just wanted to do what he wanted to do. And that's where we've got the first 4 self-titled works. And I like that, you can either call it Peter Gabriel 1, 2, 3, or 4, or Car, Scratch, Melt, and Security. And then from there, you've got the more, I think his poppy accessible stuff, like the more mainstream stuff with So and Us. Within his whole discography, he was always doing like a David Bowie reinvention of himself. Like he was always expressing himself through music. And you can see this with those first 2 records being very like, I'm just trying to find my feet, trying to figure out what I want to do with my music. The next 2 of Melt and Security being like, okay, I am now going to confine myself. We're going to do as little guitars and very little like top hats and like those high tops of the drummings. Like we're just going to scratch all that. And we're going to do like very experimental stuff. And then you had more of the, MTV is really big at this point. Let's do some more accessible stuff, some more airway stuff, while still kind of keeping the Peter Gabriel brand. And then he took like a full 10 years off, and gave us Up, which still one of my favorite records. It's like, well, what do I do now that the movement is gone and I'm no longer a part of it? And how do I recontextualize myself within that? And then of course you got the Scratch My Back and I'll Scratch Yours and New Blood stuff, and the album that was released last year of I.O. So I think in terms of like musical experimentation, of reinventing themselves, of using music as art, Peter Gabriel takes the top billing in that sense. And out of all of these boys, even though Tony Banks has a very special place in my heart because he's the underdog and I don't feel he gets appreciated as much as he is, my favorite discography, if I were to take all of their discographies as a whole and say which one do I like the most, Peter Gabriel probably is the one that wins out. Even though I will say Steve Hackett probably has the stronger one. And I'm not just saying because he has the most, I'm just saying that in terms of musical presence, in terms of musical mastery, in terms of using music as art, reinventing himself, doing different things in the studio, basically inventing full-on musical stylings that then would be carried through within the 80s and 90s. I don't know. There's something about that art as craft that I think Peter Gabriel masters. And I didn't even talk about the soundtracks like Birdie, Passion, A Long Walk Home, and Ovo. These still move me to this day. And I think out of all of them, the only one I don't have is Ovo. And I really should try to track that guy down because I have everything else from Peter Gabriel and Ovo is the only one I don't have. But even that one's a little weird. We'll see. There's a reason why I don't have that one yet. So, finishing us all off, let's talk about our boy, our lovely sweet bean, our short king of Phil Collins. Out of all of the individuals, I honestly think that Phil Collins has the most successful career. I think in terms of just sheer numbers, of sheer notoriety, I mean, this was the guy that he almost became like a Hollywood movie stars. I think he starred in a number of I remember Buster was like the big one that he starred in where Hollywood was trying to make him a star. And he even has like a small cameo in Hook. At the beginning, he plays one of the police officers that investigates where the kids went to. So he has like little cameos here and there. Even with all that, he still has, and I believe if you look on the Wikipedia, he's even credited in being in the Beatles' A Hard Day's Night. I don't know. I've watched that a number of times and I haven't been able to see him, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he isn't in there. And also, little side note, which I just forgot, last year I played a lot of my old PSP games because I friggin' love my old PSP, and I finally was able to track down a copy of Grand Theft Auto Vice City. He legitimately has a couple of cameos in that game.
Listen, sweetheart, please take out your many frustrations on Barry, will you? And leave me alone.
Barry?
yeah, let's talk about his albums. I think my favorite one from him, honestly, is No Jacket Required, the 1985 one, and his discography is full pop. Like it's 100% pop. You know, starting with Face Value in 1981, it was pretty much all pop all the time, and no beef with that. You know, I know some people are like, oh, he's a sellout and blah blah blah. I'm like, this is the music that he wanted to play. You know, he has a background in the big bands, and that could be found within a number of his albums, kind of on the first couple of ones, and definitely on some of the other ones like Dancing into the Light, Testifying, Going Back. You definitely hear those big band sound qualities, you know, that jazzy big band stuff. I still think that No Jacket Required is my favorite. You know, it has Sue Studio and Take Me Home, two of my favorite tracks from him. But even then, Face Value, you know, you have In the Air Tonight, and a couple of reworkings. I think just the one reworking from a track from Duke from Genesis. But even like Hello, I Must Be Going is really fun, because I believe that's the one that has Can't Hurry Love, which is another one of his that I love. But Seriously, I think is the last of his like really gold records. After that, I didn't really feel all that connected to, I mean, if I'm being perfectly honest, I don't feel all that connected to his discography as a whole, but I still get enjoyment out of it. You know, I can still recognize that this is fun pop music that I really, really enjoy. Now, what I enjoy a little bit more is his time with Brand X. And I know that there's a number of people that were like, oh, what about Brand X? What about Brand X? And I'm like, well, let's talk about Brand X. Obviously, he's not in the band anymore. He left in 1979 and took a little bit of a dip between 1976 and 1977. So the albums that he was actually featured on was Unorthodox Behavior, which is the only one that I actually own, even though I have listened to Moroccan Roll, which is just a really fun play on words. And then I believe his last album that he was actually like really credited to was Product. Now, I know that he had a little bit of help with Do They Hurt? Is There Anything About Missing Period? And I think that's it. Like, he was also, I think, credited to a couple of live things like Live Stock 77, Live at the Roxy LA, and Live from Ronnie Scott's. But honestly, if you haven't listened to Brand X and you've gotten this far within the video, highly, highly recommend. Like, this was his jazz fusion records. Like, it's so interesting within this music, and I almost wish that this band got a little bit more notoriety than it did. Like, it's one of those like if you know you know kind of a bands, but man, just diving into his like really avant-garde and jazz fusion stuff, you know, this kind of gives like Return to Forever vibes, if that makes any connection to anybody. And yeah, I really love the fact that this guy, you know, here's good old Phil Collins, you know, In the Air Tonight, and Sue Studio playing ridiculous music. And again, much like Tony Banks's records, I wish that these ones got a little bit more of the notoriety, even though I think these albums get more notoriety than Tony Banks's records do. So anyway, that's kind of my thoughts. That's my big rambling of all the solo careers of all the Genesis members. As I mentioned, just to kind of wrap this up once again, how I said at the beginning, Phil Collins definitely the most popular and I would say financially successful. Peter Gabriel, definitely the more artistic success, you know, reinventing himself and using art, like using music as art. Steve Hackett having the most loyal fan base and having some of the best output in terms of the music on there. Tony Banks having some of the best music. You know, he's kind of the unsung hero in my mind. But also like Mike Rutherford going on with Mike and the Mechanics and his own solo stuff being very, very good. And even Anthony Phillips. You know, Anthony Phillips still kicking, still putting out music. You know, I don't think, you know, we shouldn't just kind of shove him aside. I think he needs some love too. So yeah, what do you guys think about all this? What was your favorite output in terms of catalog for these, you know, these ex-Genesis boys? Which one do you think had the most successful? Which one do you think is the most popular? Yeah, let me know of your own thoughts about this by commenting down below. And that's what I've got for you guys today. So with that being said, thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until the next one, notes out.